In the quaint village of St. Mary Mead, a baker is poisoned by his own bread, and the shadow of murder falls over the idyllic lanes. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and sharper mind, unravels a web of secrets: grieving widow, nervous apprentice, disgruntled customer, and a scheming supplier. As whispers of greed and betrayal surface, only one question remains: who laced the flower with death? Dive into a tale of deception, where every crumb holds a clue. Chapter 1. The Village Loaf. The morning sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, its rays filtering through the ancient elms that lined the high street. The village, nestled in a fold of the English countryside, hummed with the gentle rhythm of daily life. Milk bottles clinked on doorsteps, the postman's bicycle rattled over cobblestones, and the scent of fresh bread wafted from Thomas Wren's bakery, a modest shop with a painted sign that read "Wren's Loaves" in cheerful red letters. To the villagers, this bakery was more than a shop. It was a ritual, a place where gossip was kneaded into conversation as surely as yeast into dough. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her cottage window, her nimble fingers guiding knitting needles through a skein of pale blue wool, observed the morning's quiet bustle. Her cottage, Rose View, stood at the heart of the village, its lace-curtained windows offering a perfect vantage point for the comings and goings of St. Mary Mead. She was a slight elderly woman, her white hair neatly pinned, her eyes bright with a curiosity that belied her age. To the casual observer, she was merely a spinster with a penchant for knitting and gardening. But those who knew her understood that Miss Marple's mind was as sharp as the needles she wielded, capable of unraveling mysteries as deftly as she unraveled a tangled stitch. The peace of the morning was shattered by a commotion. Janet, Miss Marple's young maid, burst through the door, her apron askew, her round face flushed with excitement. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful," she gasped, clutching the door frame. "Mr. Wren, the baker, he's dead. Found this morning in his shop, slumped right over the counter with a bit of bread beside him. They're saying it's poison." Miss Marple's needles paused, suspended in mid-air, her blue eyes, keen behind their spectacles, fixed on Janet. "Poison, you say?" Her voice was soft, almost detached, but her mind was already turning, sifting through the implications. How very curious. And the bread was it his own? "That's what they're saying, Miss. His own, rye loaf, half-eaten. Dr. Haydock was called, and he's sure it's arsenic. The whole village is in a tizzy." Janet's words tumbled out, her hands gesturing wildly. Mrs. Wren's beside herself, and young Peter, the apprentice, looks like he's seen a ghost. Miss Marple set her knitting in her lap, her fingers resting lightly on the wool. "Arsenic in a baker's bread," she mused, her tone thoughtful. "A man's own craft turned against him. That is not merely tragic, Janet, it is deliberate." She rose, smoothing her skirt, and reached for her shawl. "I think, perhaps, I shall take a walk to the bakery. Fresh air is so clarifying, don't you think?" Janet, still breathless, nodded. "Shall I come with you, Miss?" "No, my dear, you've enough to do here. But do keep your ears open. Village talk is often more revealing than it seems." With a gentle smile, Miss Marple stepped into the crisp autumn air, her mind already piecing together the fragments of this grim puzzle. The high street was abuzz as she approached the bakery. A small crowd had gathered, their whispers rising like steam from a kettle. Mrs. Bantry, the vicar's wife, stood at the edge, her hat slightly askew. "Jane," she called, waving Miss Marple over, "isn't it shocking? Poor Thomas Wren. Gone just like that. Who would do such a thing? Indeed, Dolly, Miss Marple replied, her voice mild but her eyes scanning the faces around her. It is most distressing. I thought I might offer my condolences to Mrs. Wren. The bakery door stood ajar, its bell silent. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of yeast and tragedy. Eliza Wren sat behind the counter, her hands clasped tightly, her dark hair escaping its bun. She was a striking woman, her beauty tempered by grief for, perhaps, Miss Marple noted, by something more. Miss Marple, Eliza said, rising, her voice tremulous. It's kind of you to come. I can't believe he's gone. My dear, I am so sorry, Miss Marple said, her tone warm but her gaze steady. It must be a terrible shock. Was Thomas unwell yesterday? No, not at all, Eliza replied, her eyes brimming. He was up before dawn, as always, baking. He loved his work, you know. He'd never have made a mistake with the bread. Her voice faltered, and Miss Marple caught a flicker of hesitation, as if Eliza had stopped short of saying more. Young Peter. The apprentice hovered near the ovens, his lanky frame hunched, his hands, dusted with flour, fidgeted with his apron. I didn't do anything wrong, Miss Marple, he blurted, unprompted. I just mixed the dough like he told me. His eyes darted to Eliza, then to the floor. Of course, Peter, Miss Marple said soothingly, but her mind noted his unease, the way his words tumbled out too quickly. She glanced around the shop, its shelves lined with loaves now destined to go stale. A single slice of rye bread, wrapped in cloth, lay on the counter evidence, no doubt, for the constable. Such a tragedy, she murmured, and so very strange. As she left the bakery, Miss Marple's thoughts were already weaving a pattern. Poison in a baker's bread was no accident. It was a calculated act, born of motive as yet unseen. Eliza's trembling hands, Peter's nervous glance, the whispers of the village all were threads in a tapestry she would soon unravel. For now, she walked slowly home, her shawl drawn close, her mind as sharp as the autumn breeze. Chapter 2. The morning household. The afternoon sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the cobbled streets as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the bakery once more. The village, though outwardly serene with its thatched cottages and blooming gardens, thrummed with an undercurrent of unease. The death of Thomas Wren, the baker whose rye loaves had been the pride of the parish, had stirred the community like a stone cast into a still pond. Whispers of poison arsenic, no less, had spread from doorstep to doorstep, and Miss Marple, with her quiet step and unassuming air, was determined to sift through the ripples for truth. The bakery, usually alive with the clatter of trays and the warm scent of bread, stood hushed, its windows dimmed by drawn blinds. The sign reading Wren's Loaves seemed almost mocking now, a relic of a time before tragedy had kneaded itself into the village's daily bread. Miss Marple paused at the door, her gloved hand resting lightly on the handle. She was no stranger to grief, nor to the masks it could inspire. People, she knew, revealed themselves most in moments of blossom through tears, others through silence, and a few through secrets they could not quite conceal. Inside, the air was heavy, not with the comforting aroma of baking, but with the weight of sorrow, or perhaps, Miss Marple thought, something less pure. Eliza Wren sat at a small table near the counter, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She was a woman of striking presence, her dark hair still escaping its pins, her face pale but composed. Her eyes, however, betrayed a flicker of something, beyond grief-fear, perhaps, or guilt. Miss Marple noted it with the same care she gave to a dropped stitch in her knitting. "Mrs. Wren," Miss Marple said softly, stepping forward, her voice as gentle as a breeze. "I hope I'm not intruding. I thought you might welcome a visitor in such a trying time." Eliza looked up, her lips parting in a faint, tremulous smile. "Miss Marple, you're very kind. Please, do come in. It's so quiet without Thomas." Her voice broke on his name, and she pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. Though her eyes remained dry, Miss Marple settled into a chair opposite, her small, neat figure a study in calm. "It must be a dreadful shock," she said, her tone warm, but probing, like a needle testing the fabric, "to lose your husband so suddenly and in such a way. The village is quite shaken." Eliza nodded, her fingers twisting the handkerchief. "I can't make sense of it. Thomas was so careful, so proud of his work. He'd never have let anything harmful into his bread. It's unthinkable." Her words were earnest, but Miss Marple caught a hesitation, a slight pause before harmful, as if Eliza had chosen the word with care. "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes drifting to the counter, where a few loaves remained untouched. "Since morning, his bread was the heart of St. Mary Mead. I recall his rye loaf, particularly such a rich flavour. Did he bake it himself yesterday?" "Oh, yes," Eliza said quickly. "He was up before dawn, as always. He loved the early hours, said the quiet helped him think. Peter helped with the mixing, but Thomas always shaped the loaves himself." She glanced toward the back of the shop, where the ovens stood cold. At that moment, Peter, the apprentice, emerged from the shadows of the bakehouse. He was a lanky youth of 17, with sandy hair and a face that might have been handsome were it not so pinched with anxiety. His apron, dusted with flour, hung loosely on his frame, and his hands fidgeted as if unsure of their purpose. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "didn't expect to see you again so soon." "I find a second visit often brings clarity," Miss Marple replied, her smile disarming. "You must be terribly shaken, Peter, to lose your master so suddenly." Peter shifted, his eyes darting to Eliza, then to the floor. "It's awful, Miss I don't know what to do now. The bakery's all I've got." His words were halting, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers plucked at his apron, a nervous tick that spoke of more than grief. "You were fond of Mr. Wren, I'm sure," she said, her tone gentle but her gaze sharp. "He must have been a fine teacher." "He was," Peter said, too quickly. "Taught me everything mixing, kneading, all of it. I just did what he told me yesterday, same as always." His voice rose, defensive, and Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, though her expression remained serene. "Of course," she said soothingly, "it's only natural to feel unsettled. Such a tragedy." She turned to Eliza, her eyes soft, but searching. "And you, my dear, how are you managing? It can't be easy, alone in this house." Eliza's hands stilled, and for a moment her composure wavered. "It's strange," she admitted. "The house feels so empty without his footsteps, his voice. But I must keep the bakery going, for his sake." Her words were resolute, but Miss Marple caught a tremor in her voice, a hint of something unspoken. The room fell silent, save for the faint creak of the floorboards as Peter shifted his weight. Miss Marple's mind, ever active, began to weave the threads of what she had seen and heard. Eliza's grief seemed genuine, yet there was a guardedness in her manner, a careful choice of words that suggested more than widow's sorrow. Peter, too, was uneasy, his defensiveness hinting at a burden he carried, whether of guilt or fear. Human nature, Miss Marple knew, was a complex tapestry, and in St. Mary Mead, as in any village, secrets lurked beneath the surface like stones in a stream. "May I see the bakehouse?" Miss Marple asked, rising with a sprightliness that belied her years. "I've always been curious about how such fine bread is made." Eliza hesitated, then nodded. "Of course, it's not much to see now, but you're welcome." She led the way to the back, where the bakehouse opened into a spacious room dominated by two large ovens, their iron doors cold and silent. Sacks of flour lined one wall, their labels proclaiming Grimsby's Mill, finest quality. A long table stood in the centre, dusted with flour, and a rack held trays of unbaked dough, now destined to go to waste. Miss Marple moved slowly, her eyes taking in every detail, the neat rows of tools, the faint smudge of flour on the table's edge, the locked cupboard in the corner. "Such a tidy workspace," she remarked, her voice light. "Thomas must have been very particular." "He was," Eliza said, a note of pride in her voice. "He always said a baker's craft was in the details. He'd check every sack of flour himself, weigh it, even test it sometimes. Test it." Miss Marple's tone was casual, but her eyes sharpened. "How interesting. For quality, I suppose." Eliza nodded, though her hands tightened on her handkerchief. "Yes, to ensure it was fresh, free of weevils or anything else." The pause was slight, but Miss Marple caught it, filing it away, with the other fragments of the morning dot. Peter, lingering by the door, spoke up. He was fussy about the rye especially, said it had to be just right for the flavour. His voice was steadier now, but his eyes avoided Miss Marple's, focusing instead on a spot above the ovens. "How admirable," Miss Marple said, her smile warm. "A craftsman's pride is a rare thing." She moved toward the cupboard, her fingers brushing its handle. "And this, for spices, perhaps?" Eliza's face tightened. "Just odds and ends old recipes, tools. Thomas kept it locked to keep things orderly." Her words were quick, almost rehearsed, and Miss Marple nodded, letting the matter drop for now. A locked cupboard, she thought, often held more than recipes. As they returned to the front of the shop, the bell jingled, announcing the arrival of Constable Reed, a solid, ruddy-faced man with a notebook in hand. "Miss Marple," he said, touching his cap, "didn't expect to see you here. Just come to ask Mrs. Wren a few questions." "Of course, Constable," Miss Marple said, stepping aside. "I was just offering my condolences. I'll leave you to your work." She turned to Eliza, her expression sympathetic. "Do take care, my dear. If you need a listener, you know where to find me." Eliza murmured her thanks, and Miss Marple stepped into the street, the constable's low voice fading behind her. The village was quieter now, the crowd dispersed, but the air still carried the weight of suspicion. As she walked home, Miss Marple's mind sifted through the morning's impressions. Eliza's guarded words, Peter's nervous tics, the locked cupboard all were pieces of a puzzle that, in time, would form a picture. She thought of her nephew Raymond, who often teased her for seeing mysteries in every village squabble. "See too much, Aunt Jane," he'd say. But Miss Marple knew that it was precisely in seeing too much that truth was found. Back at Roseview, Janet was waiting, her eyes bright with fresh gossip. "They're saying in the village that Thomas had words with Harold Grimsby last week," she said, setting a teapot on the table. "Something about the flour being off. And Mrs. Hodges, that customer of his, She's been telling everyone he cheated her on a loaf. Miss Marple poured her tea, her movements deliberate. Is that so? She said, her voice mild. How interesting. People do talk, don't they? She sipped her tea, her mind already tracing connections. Grimsby, the flour supplier, with his mill on the village's edge. Mrs. Hodges, with her sharp tongue and sharper grudges. Eliza, with her trembling hands. And Peter, with his darting eyes. Each, she knew, held a piece of the truth, and it was her task to weave them together. As the afternoon faded into evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting resumed. The needles clicked rhythmically, a counterpoint to her thoughts. Arsenic in a baker's bread was no accident. It was a deliberate act, born of motive as yet unseen. She thought of the village, with its tidy gardens and hidden resentments, and of the bakery, where a man's pride had become his poison. Human nature, she murmured to herself, is the same everywhere, whether in St. Mary Mead or London. And with that, she picked up her needles, her mind as sharp as ever, ready to unravel the threads of this dark and tangled tale. Chapter 3. The supplier's shadow. The morning market in St. Mary Mead was a lively affair. Its stalls brimming with apples, cabbages, and bolts of homespun cloth, all bathed in the crisp light of late autumn. Villagers bustled about, their baskets swinging, their voices weaving a tapestry of chatter that was as much a currency as the coins they exchanged. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat tilted against the sun, moved through the crowd with the quiet grace of a woman who knew her place in the world, and everyone else's. Her errand was simple enough, a skein of wool from Mrs. Tuttle's stall. But her true purpose lay elsewhere, in the shadow of a man whose flour had fed the village and, perhaps, poisoned its baker. Harold Grimsby's stall stood at the market's edge, its sacks of flour stacked high, their labels proclaiming Grimsby's mill, finest quality, in bold black letters. Grimsby himself, a burly man with a florid face and a smile that seemed to strain at the seams, was haggling with a customer over a sack of barley meal. His voice boomed, hearty but forced, and Miss Marple noted the way his hands, broad and calloused, fidgeted with the twine on a sack. She approached slowly, her small figure almost lost among the taller villagers, her eyes bright with the curiosity that had solved many a village riddle. "Good morning, Mr. Grimsby," she said, her voice as mild as the breeze that stirred the market's dust. "I see your stall is as busy as ever. Your flour does make the finest loaves." Grimsby turned, his smile widening but not quite reaching his eyes. "Miss Marple, a pleasure, as always. Aye, my flour's the best in the county, if I do say so. Poor Thomas Wren swore by it, God rest him." He wiped his brow with a handkerchief, though the day was cool, and Miss Marple's keen gaze caught the faint tremor in his hand. "Such a tragedy," she said, her tone sympathetic, but her eyes never leaving his face. "To think that a man could die by his own bread. It must be a shock to you, supplying his flour as you did." Grimsby's smile faltered, just for a moment. "A shock, I never thought I'd see the day. Thomas was a good man, a good customer." He busied himself with rearranging a sack, his movements jerky. "Can't imagine how it happened. Arsenic, they say. Terrible business." "Terrible indeed," Miss Marple agreed, her fingers adjusting the brim of her hat. "And so curious, don't you think? Arsenic in a baker's flour, it's almost as if someone meant it to be there." Her words were gentle, but they hung in the air like a question. and she watched Grimsby closely. He laughed, a short, barking sound. Meant it. No, no, Miss Marple. Must have been an accident. Maybe some rat poison got mixed in somewhere. Happens, you know, in mills or storerooms. His eyes darted to the side, avoiding hers, and Miss Marple noted the sheen of sweat on his forehead. Perhaps, she said, her smile serene, though Thomas was so particular, wasn't he? I heard he tested his flour himself to ensure its quality. Did he ever mention anything amiss with your deliveries? Grimsby's hand paused on the sack, his knuckles whitening. Amiss? No, nothing like that. Thomas was pleased with my flour, always said it was the best. We had a good arrangement, him and me. His voice was firm, but Miss Marple caught the slight hitch in it, the way his gaze flickered toward the crowd, as if seeking escape. How fortunate, she said, her tone as light as ever. A reliable supplier is a treasure. Though I did hear village talk. You know that Thomas had words with you last week. Something about the flour, perhaps. Grimsby's face reddened, and he straightened, his bulk looming over her. Village talks, just that talk. People love to stir up trouble. Thomas and I never had a cross word. Business as usual, that's all. He turned to a customer, dismissing her with a nod. Excuse me, Miss Marple, got to see to this lot. Of course, she said, stepping back, her expression unchanged. I mustn't keep you from your work. Good day, Mr. Grimsby. She turned away, her steps measured, but her mind was already at work, sifting through his words like flour through a sieve. Grimsby's bluster, his evasive eyes, his too quick denial, they were all threads in the tapestry of this mystery, and Miss Marple was adept at tracing such threads to their source. As she moved through the market, pausing to admire a basket of apples or exchange a word with Mrs. Tuttle, she recalled what she knew of Grimsby. His mill on the village's edge had been a fixture for years, its great wheel turning steadily, as it ground wheat and rye for St. Mary, Mead and beyond. But recently she had heard whispers Janet, her maid, was a font of such tidings that Grimsby's business had faltered. A rival miller in Lower Mead, one Josiah Trent, had begun to undercut his prices, drawing customers away. Grimsby, with his hearty laugh and expansive gestures, had always struck Miss Marple as a man of ambition, perhaps too much so. Could such ambition, she wondered, have driven him to remove a rival, not another miller, but a baker who might have uncovered some flaw in his trade? She paused by a stall selling jams, her fingers brushing the glass jars as her thoughts wandered. Thomas Wren, by all accounts, had been a meticulous man, proud of his craft. If he had suspected something wrong with Grimsby's flour adulteration, perhaps, or worse might, he have confronted the supplier. And if Grimsby's livelihood was at stake, might he have taken drastic measures to silence such a threat? Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, a sign of her mind at work. It was a theory, nothing more, but theories, like seeds, could grow with the right tending. Her musings were interrupted by the sight of young Peter, the baker's apprentice, weaving through the crowd. His lanky frame was hunched, his hands thrust deep into his pockets, and his eyes scanned the market with a nervous intensity. Miss Marple watched him pause near Grimsby's stall, his gaze lingering on the supplier before he turned away, his steps quickening. There was something furtive in his manner, something that reminded her of a boy in her nephew Raymond's stories, caught pilfering apples but hiding a greater mischief. She made a mental note to speak with Peter again, for boys of 17, she knew, often saw more than they admitted, as she left the market. Her basket now holding the skein of wool, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Grimsby. His unease had been palpable, his denials too emphatic. She recalled a similar case in St. Mary Mead years ago, when a grocer's assistant had been caught watering down the milk. The man's bluster, his quick excuses, had been much like Grimsby's, and Miss Marple had learned then that such behaviour often masked a deeper truth. She would need to visit the mill, she decided, to see for herself the place where Thomas's Florand, perhaps, his poison had originated. The village clock struck noon as she reached Rose View, its chimes a gentle reminder of time's steady march. Janet greeted her at the door, her eyes bright with fresh gossip. "They're saying at the post office that Grimsby's been boasting about buying new machinery for his mill," she said, taking Miss Marple's basket. "Says he'll outdo that Trent fellow in Lower Mead, and Mrs. Hodges was there, too, still fuming about her loaf. Says Thomas shorted her on purpose." Miss Marple smiled faintly, settling into her armchair. "How interesting," she said, reaching for her knitting. "People do reveal themselves in their talk, don't they?" She poured a cup of tea from the pot Janet had prepared, her mind already tracing the threads of Grimsby's ambition. Peter's furtiveness, and the village's restless chatter. The market had given her much to ponder, and she knew that somewhere, in the shadow of those flour sacks, lay a clue to Thomas Wren's death. Her needles clicked softly, a rhythm as steady as her thoughts, as she began to unravel the mystery of the poisoned baker. Chapter 4. The disgruntled customer. The afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, painting the village in hues of amber and gold as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the modest cottage of Mrs. Clara Hodges. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves, and the high street was quieter now, the market's bustle having faded into the rhythm of late-day chores. Miss Marple's steps were unhurried, her straw hat tilted slightly against the breeze, but her mind was as active as ever, turning over the threads of Thomas Wren's death like a skein of wool to be sorted. Clara Hodges, known for her sharp tongue and sharper grudges, had been a regular at Wren's bakery and, more pertinently, had quarrelled with the baker just days before his poisoning. To Miss Marple, whose understanding of human nature rivaled her skill with knitting needles, such a quarrel was a thread worth following. The Hodges cottage stood at the edge of the village, its garden tidy but unremarkable, its windows gleaming with the pride of a fastidious housekeeper. Miss Marple knocked lightly, her gloved hand barely disturbing the silence, and the door opened to reveal Clara herself, a wiry woman in her 50s with a face set in lines of perpetual indignation. Her grey hair was pulled into a severe bun, and her eyes, sharp as flint, sized up her visitor with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "Miss Marple," Clara said, her voice clipped but polite. "What brings you here? Not often we get such distinguished company." There was a faint edge to her words, as if courtesy were a garment she wore reluctantly. "I was passing by." "Mrs. Hodges," Miss Marple replied, her tone as gentle as the rustle of leaves, "and I thought it only right to call after the dreadful news about poor Mr. Wren. You were one of his regulars, I believe. It must be such a shock." Clara's lips tightened, and she gestured for Miss Marple to enter. "Shock? Yes, you could say that. Come in, then. I've just put the kettle on." She led the way to a small parlour, its furniture polished to a high sheen, its walls adorned with framed samplers proclaiming virtues like patience and duty. A man sat by the fire, his head bent over a newspaper. Mr. Hodges, Clara's husband, a quiet figure known for his reticence. He glanced up, nodded briefly, and returned to his reading, his presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "The village is quite shaken," she said, her eyes soft but watchful. "To think of poison in a baker's bread, it's almost unimaginable. Did you see Mr. Wren recently, Mrs. Hodges?" Clara poured tea with a brisk efficiency, her movements betraying a restless energy. "I saw him last week," she said, her voice sharp, "and we had words, if you must know. He shorted me on a loaf of his precious rye, gave me one half the size it should have been, and charged me full price. Smug about it, too, as if I wouldn't notice." She set the teapot down with a clink, her cheeks flushing. "I told him what I thought of his cheek, and he just laughed. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression one of polite concern. "How provoking," she said. "It's so disappointing when a tradesman isn't quite honest. But surely you didn't think him capable of something worse? Clara's eyes narrowed. "I didn't like the man, Miss Marple. I'll not pretend otherwise. But poison, that's a step too far, even for me." She laughed, a short, brittle sound, but her hands, gripping her teacup, trembled slightly. Miss Marple noted the tremor, wondering if it stemmed from anger, fear, or something deeper. Mr. Hodges shifted in his chair, the newspaper rustling. "Clara's got a temper," he said, his voice low and measured, the first words he'd spoken. "But she's no poisoner. She just likes things fair." His eyes met Miss Marple's briefly, then returned to the paper, as if he'd exhausted his quota of speech. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile reassuring. "A sense of fairness is so important. And you, Mr. Hodges, did you ever find fault with Mr. Wren's goods?" Mr. Hodges shook his head, barely looking up. "Never went to the bakery myself. Clara handles that. Wren's bread was fine, far as I know." His tone was flat, almost indifferent, but Miss Marple caught a flicker in his expression, a guardedness, perhaps, or a reluctance to engage. She turned back to Clara, her voice as gentle as ever. "It must be difficult, losing such a reliable baker. Did you notice anything unusual at the shop recently? Any visitors, perhaps, or odd behavior?" Clara's lips pursed, and she set her teacup down with deliberate care. "Nothing out of the ordinary, except for Wren's attitude. Though I did see that supplier of his, Grimsby, hanging about more than usual. Always talking business, thick as thieves, those two, and young Peter, the apprentice, he's an odd one, skulking about, always looking like he's hiding something." Her tone was accusatory, but Miss Marple sensed a relish in her words, as if she enjoyed casting suspicion. "How interesting," Miss Marple said, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. "Young Peter does seem a nervous sort. And Mr. Grimsby such a bustling man, isn't he? Always eager to expand his trade, I hear." Clara snorted. "Eager's one word for it. Greedy's another. He's been boasting about new machinery. Says he'll outdo that miller in Lower Mead. As if we care about his grand plans." She leaned forward, her voice dropping. "Mind you, I heard Thomas wasn't happy with him lately. Something about the flour not being up to snuff. Wouldn't surprise me if Grimsby cut corners, man, like that. All talk and no substance." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest, but her mind was cataloguing every word. Clara's indignation seemed genuine, her grudge against Thomas rooted in a sense of personal slight. Yet there was a performative quality to her outrage, a hint of exaggeration that suggested she enjoyed the role of a grieved customer. And Mr. Hodges, so silent, so withdrawn, what did his reticence conceal? Miss Marple knew that quiet men often saw more than they said, and she resolved to keep an eye on him. The conversation turned to village matters, the harvest festival, the vicar's latest sermon, but Miss Marple steered it gently back to the bakery. "Did you ever see Mrs. Wren at the shop?" she asked, her tone casual. "She must be devastated. Poor woman." Clara's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Eliza, oh, she's playing the grieving widow well enough. Always thought she was a bit too grand for a baker's wife, with her fine dresses and airs. Mind you, I saw her talking to that salesman fellow a few weeks back, to clothes for my liking, if you know what I mean." She raised an eyebrow, her voice dripping with implication. Miss Marple's smile remained serene, but her mind noted the insinuation. Village gossip, she knew, was often a distorted mirror, reflecting truth through a haze of malice or envy. Yet Clara's words about Eliza and the salesman echoed Janet's earlier tidings, and Miss Marple tucked the information away like a stitch held for later. As she rose to leave, thanking Clara for the tea, Mr. Hodges spoke again, his voice barely above a murmur. "It's a bad business, Miss Marple. Poison's a coward's way. Whoever did it, they'll slip up sooner or later." His eyes met hers, steady for a moment, and she sensed a depth to his words, as if he knew more than he let on. "Indeed, Mr. Hodges," she said, her tone thoughtful. "Truth has a way of rising, like dough left too long." She bid them goodbye and stepped into the fading light, her mind turning over the encounter. Clara's prickly pride, her quickness to cast suspicion on Grimsby and Eliza, suggested a woman who thrived on conflict, yet her anger at Thomas seemed too petty for murdering. Less Miss Marple mused, it masked a deeper motive. And Mr. Hodges, with his sparse words and watchful eyes, was a puzzle in himself. Was he merely a bystander, or did his silence hide a keener interest in the baker's fate? As she walked home, the village settling into the hush of evening, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the broader tapestry of the case. Clara's accusations against Grimsby dovetailed with the whispers of his rivalry with the Lower Mead miller, and her hint about Eliza's flirtations added a new thread to the pattern. Peter's nervousness, Grimsby's unease, Eliza's guardedness, and now Clara's venom were pieces of a puzzle that, in time, would form a coherent whole. Miss Marple knew that human nature, with its jealousies and ambitions, was the key to unlocking such mysteries, and St. Mary Mead, for all its quaint charm, was no stranger to such frailties. Back at Roseview, Janet greeted her with a fresh pot of tea and more gossip. "They're saying at the grocer's that Mrs. Hodges was in a right state after her row with Mr. Wren," she said, her eyes wide, "and someone saw Peter near the mill last night, looking all sneaky-like." Miss Marple smiled, settling into her armchair. "How very interesting," she said, reaching for her knitting. Her needles clicked softly, a counterpoint to her thoughts, as she wove together the day's impressions. Clara Hodges, with her sharp tongue and sharper grudges, had given her much to ponder, and Miss Marple knew that somewhere, in the tangle of village rivalries and hidden truths, lay the answer to the poisoned baker's death. Chapter 5. The village whisper of the evening had settled over St. Mary Mead like a soft blanket, the villagers' lights twinkling through the dusk as Miss Jane Marple sat by her fire at Roseview. The cottage was a haven of quiet, its walls adorned with faded watercolours and shelves of well-thumbed books, but the air was alive with the hum of her thoughts. Her knitting lay in her lap, the needle still for now, as she turned over the fragments of the Dather-guarded grief of Eliza Wren. The nervous tics of young Peter, the bluster of Harold Grimsby, and the sharp-edged indignation of Clara Hodges. Each encounter had added a thread to the tapestry of Thomas Wren's death, and Miss Marple knew that the village's gossip, often dismissed as idle chatter, could hold the key to unravelling it. In St. Mary Mead, as in any small community, secrets were rarely silent. They whispered through tea shops and doorways, waiting for a keen ear to catch them. Janet, her maid, bustled in with a tray of tea and biscuits, her face alight with the eagerness of one bearing fresh tidings. "Oh, Miss Marple, you'll never guess what I heard at the post office this evening," she said, setting the tray down with a clatter. "It's all about the bakery, and folks are talking up a storm." Miss Marple's eyes brightened behind her spectacles, though her expression remained serene. "Are they, now?" she said, pouring tea with a steady hand. "And what are they saying, Janet? Do sit down and tell me." Janet perched on the edge of a chair, her hand smoothing her apron as if to contain her excitement. "Well, for one, there's talk about Mrs. Wren-Eliza, that is. Mrs. Tuttle, from the wool stall, swears she saw her chatting with that travelling salesman, Mr. Carver, behind the bakery last month. All cosy-like," she said, laughing and carrying on, "and not for the first time, either." Janet's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "Some folks are saying Eliza was tired of Thomas, what with him always in the bakehouse and her wanting finer things." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind filing away the information. "How interesting," she said, her tone mild. "Village talk often exaggerates, but there's usually a grain of truth in it. And Mr. Carver this would be. The gentleman selling kitchenware, I presume." "That's him," Janet nodded, her eyes wide. "Flashy sort, always in a smart suit, with a smile that's a bit too slick. Mrs. Tuttle says Eliza was blushing like a schoolgirl when he was around. Makes you wonder, doesn't it?" "Indeed it does," Miss Marple murmured, her fingers brushing the wool in her lap. Eliza's guarded manner at the bakery, the tremor in her hands, could it stem from more than grief? An indiscretion, perhaps, or the fear of one being discovered. Miss Marple knew that love, or its counterfeit, could drive people to desperate acts, and she resolved to learn more about this Mr. Carver. "There's more," Janet went on, leaning forward. "Young Peter, the apprentice's, been seen wandering near Grimsby's mill at odd hours. Tommy Pierce, the butcher's boy, says he spotted him there 2 nights ago, skulking about like he was up to no good. And Mrs. Bantry heard from the milkman that Peter was muttering about leaving the bakery, saying he was fed up with Thomas's rules." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Skulking, you say? How curious. A lad of 17 often has secrets, but they're not always sinister. Still, it's worth noting." She thought of Peter's nervous demeanor, his quick defensiveness in the bakehouse. Was he hiding a boyish mischief, or something darker? And why the mill, of all places? The connection to Grimsby, with his evasive eyes and forced cheer, was too pointed to ignore. Janet wasn't finished. "And then there's Mr. Grimsby himself," she said, her voice dropping lower still. "The grocer's wife says he's been boasting about expanding his mill, talking big about new contracts and outdoing that Trent fellow in Lower Mead. But here's the thing, she heard him and Thomas had a proper row last week, right in the bakery. Something about the flour being off, not up to Thomas's standards. Grimsby was red in the face, she said, shouting loud enough to be heard down the street. Miss Marple's needles resumed their soft clicking, a rhythm that matched the steady turning of her thoughts. "A row with Thomas," she said, almost to herself, "and about the flour, no less. That's very suggestive, Janet." She recalled Grimsby's unease at the market, his quick dismissal of any trouble with Thomas. A man with ambitions, faced with a threat to his trade, might act rashly, especially if that threat came from a meticulous baker who tested his flour. The locked cupboard in the mill, too, lingered in her mind, its contents a mystery she was determined to explore. She set her knitting aside, her eyes distant. "Village talk is like a river, Janet," she said. "It flows freely, carrying all sorts of debris, but somewhere in it, there's always a pebble of truth. The trick is finding it without getting swept away." She smiled, her expression as gentle as ever, but her mind was a steel trap, sorting through the gossip for patterns. Janet, undeterred, pressed on. "There's one more thing, miss. Mrs. Hodges was at the post office, still going on about her loaf. Says she's glad Thomas got what was coming to him, though she swears she didn't mean poison. But her husband quiet, Mr. Hodges, he just stood there, not saying a word, but looking like he wanted to. Mrs. Tuttle says he's always like that, watching and listening, never speaking unless he has to." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts returning to the Hodges parlour, to Clara's sharp tongue and her husband's silent presence. "Mr. Hodges is an observer," she said, "and observers often see what others miss. It's the quiet ones, Janet, who bear watching." She recalled his brief comment about poison being a coward's way, the steady look in his eyes. Was he merely a bystander, or did his silence conceal a deeper knowledge? The fire crackled, casting shadows on the walls, and Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind weaving the day's threads into a pattern. Eliza's possible indiscretion with the salesman, Peter's nocturnal wanderings, Grimsby's quarrel with Thomas, and the Hodges' simmering resentment, all were pieces of a puzzle that pointed to human frailties: love, ambition, pride, and perhaps betrayal. She thought of a similar case in St. Mary Mead, years ago, when a farmer's wife had spread rumours about a neighbour to deflect suspicion from her own misdeeds. Gossip, Miss Marple knew, was a mirror, often distorted but always reflecting something. "Real, Janet," she said, setting her cup down. "Do keep your ears open tomorrow. The village will talk, and we must listen. But we must also be careful not to let the noise drown out the truth." Janet nodded, her enthusiasm undimmed. "I will, miss. Shall I fetch you some more tea?" "No, thank you, my dear. I think I shall sit a while and think." Miss Marple picked up her knitting, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. The firelight danced on her spectacles, and her thoughts turned to the bakery, where a man's pride in his craft had become his undoing. The village whisper, with its tales of flirtations, quarrels, and secret wanderings, was a chorus of clues, and Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom, was its most attentive listener. She knew that somewhere in the tangle of St. Mary Mead's gossip lay the truth about the poisoned baker, and she would find it as surely as her needles found their next stitch. Chapter 6. The baker's ledger. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, shrouding the village in a veil of silver as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the small police station at the end of the high street. The air was damp, carrying the scent of wet leaves and the faint tank of wood smoke, and the cobbles glistened underfoot. Her black umbrella, held aloft against the drizzle, bobbed like a sentinel as she walked, her steps as precise as the stitches in her knitting. The death of Thomas Wren, poisoned by his own rye bread, had stirred the village into a quiet frenzy, and Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human nature, knew that answers often lay in the mundane details like ledgers, which recorded not just numbers but the pulse of a man's life. The police station was a squat, unassuming building, its walls weathered by years of rain and gossip. Constable Reed, a solid man with a ruddy face and a manner that balanced deference with duty, greeted her at the door. "Miss Marple," he said, touching his cap, his eyes betraying a mix of respect and mild exasperation. "Didn't expect you so early. Come about the Wren case, I suppose?" "Indeed, Constable," she replied, her voice as gentle as the mist outside. "I thought I might offer a little assistance, if you'll permit me. I've always found that a man's accounts can reveal much about his troubles. Might I see Mr. Wren's ledger from the bakery?" Reed hesitated, his fingers drumming on the desk. "Well, it's not usual, Miss Marple, but you've a knack for these things, and the superintendent won't mind. The ledger's here taken from the bakery yesterday." He retrieved a leather-bound book from a shelf, its pages yellowed but neatly kept. "Haven't had time to go through it properly myself. Too busy chasing village rumors." Miss Marple smiled, settling into a chair with the ledger in her lap. "Rumors have their place, Constable, but numbers are less prone to exaggeration." She opened the book, her fingers tracing the columns of figures written in Thomas Wren's precise hand. The ledger was a record of the bakery's live flour purchases, sales of loaves, payments to suppliers, and the occasional note about repairs or new equipment. To an untrained eye, it was a dry catalogue of commerce, but to Miss Marple, it was a story, one that might hold the key to a baker's death. As she turned the pages, her eyes sharpened behind her spectacles. The entries were meticulous, each transaction dated and annotated, but a pattern began to emerge. Payments to Harold Grimsby, the flour supplier, had increased steadily over the past 6 months, doubling in the last 2, yet the quantities of flour ordered remained constant: 50 pounds of rye, 1/100th of wheat, week after week. She paused at an entry from 3 weeks prior, where Thomas had scrawled a note in the margin: "Grimsby's write-off smell, test further, another." A week later, Reed spoke to H.G. Requality. "Denies issue." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, a sign of her mind at work. "How curious," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Thomas had suspected something amiss with Grimsby's flour, perhaps adulteration, or worse. Had he pressed the supplier, threatening to expose a fault that could ruin Grimsby's trade? She thought of Grimsby's unease at the market, his quick dismissal of any trouble with Thomas. A man with ambitions, faced with a loss of reputation, might take desperate measures. Constable Reed, hovering nearby, cleared his throat. "Find anything, Miss Marple, perhaps," she said, her tone mild. "Mr. Wren was a careful man, wasn't he? These notes suggest he was concerned about his flour, specifically Mr. Grimsby's rye. Did he mention anything to you about it?" Reed shook his head, rubbing his chin. "Not to me, but he did come by last month, asking about regulations for suppliers. Said he wanted to be sure everything was above board. I thought it was just his usual fussiness. He was particular, Wren was." "Particular, yes," Miss Marple agreed, closing the ledger with a soft thud. "And particular men notice things others miss. Might I take a closer look at the bakery again, Constable? There may be other papers, notes, perhaps, that could shed light." Reed nodded, accustomed to her requests. "I'll come with you. Can't have you poking about alone, not with a murder on our hands." He grabbed his coat and they set off through the mist. The ledger tucked under Miss Marple's arm like a shield. The bakery was as silent as a tomb, its blinds still drawn, its ovens cold. Eliza Wren was not there, but Peter, the apprentice, was sweeping the floor, his movements listless. He started at their arrival, his broom clattering to the ground. "Miss Marple, constable," he stammered, his face paling. "I was just tidying up." "No need to be alarmed, Peter," Miss Marple said, her smile reassuring but her eyes sharp. "We're only looking for some papers. Did Mr. Wren keep other records besides this ledger?" Peter swallowed, his hands twisting the broom handle. "Just the ledger, mostly. He had a notebook, though, for his recipes and such. Kept it in the bakehouse, in that locked cupboard." He gestured toward the back, his eyes darting away. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Reed. The locked cupboard, which Eliza had dismissed as holding odds and ends, was becoming a point of interest. "Might we see it?" she asked, her voice gentle but insistent. Peter hesitated, then nodded, leading them to the bakehouse. The cupboard, a sturdy oak affair, was secured with a small padlock. Reed produced a key, obtained from Eliza, and opened it to reveal a clutter of items: recipe cards, a tarnished measuring spoon, and a small notebook bound in black cloth. Miss Marple took the notebook, her fingers deft as she flipped through its pages. Most were filled with Thomas's recipes, each step outlined with the precision of a chemist, but toward the back she found a series of cryptic notes: rye batch, 10 halves, gritty texture. Grimsby claims purity, but sample cloudy. 11 halves. Confronted HG evasive, must act. She closed the notebook, her expression serene but her mind racing. Thomas had been investigating Grimsby's flour, testing it, questioning its quality. Had he uncovered something adulteration, perhaps, or worse, that threatened Grimsby's livelihood? And if so, had Grimsby, with his boasts of expansion and his rivalry with the Lower Mead miller, seen fit to silence him? The notes were a whisper of intent, a clue to a motive that could lead to murder. "Constable," she said, handing him the notebook, "these may be important." Mr. Wren was clearly troubled by something in his flour supply. It would be wise to have these samples tested, if any remain. Reed nodded, tucking the notebook into his pocket. "I'll send them to the laboratory in Danimouth." "Good catch, Miss Marple. You've a nose for this sort of thing." Peter, still hovering, shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't know about any of that," he said, unprompted. "I just mixed what he told me. He never said the flour was bad." His voice was defensive, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes avoided hers, lingering instead on the cupboard's open door. "Of course, Peter," she said, her tone soothing. "You've been a great help." But as she spoke, she recalled Janet's gossip about Peter's late-night wanderings near the mill. Was he merely a nervous apprentice, caught in the wake of his master's death? Or did he know more than he let on? Boys, she knew, could be drawn into schemes beyond their understanding, their loyalty twisted by fear or promise. As they left the bakery, the mist had begun to lift, revealing the village in sharp relief. Miss Marple's thoughts were as clear as the emerging sun, piecing together the ledger's revelations with the village's whispers. Thomas Wren's suspicions about Grimsby's flour, his notes of confrontation, pointed to a tension that could have turned deadly. Grimsby's ambition, Peter's unease, Eliza's guardedness, and Clara Hodges's venom were threads in a pattern that was slowly taking shape. She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead years ago, when a shopkeeper's ledger had revealed a debt that led to theft. Numbers, like gossip, could tell stories. And Thomas Wren's ledger was speaking loudly. Back at Rose View, Janet greeted her with a fresh pot of tea and a question. "Any luck, Miss Marple? Did you find something at the station?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, settling into her armchair. "The truth, Janet, is like a loaf of bread. It takes time to rise. But the ingredients are all there, if you know where to look." Her needles resumed their clicking, and her mind turned to the mill, where a locked cupboard and a supply of secrets awaited her scrutiny. The baker's ledger had given her a glimpse of motive, and she was determined to follow it, as surely as her needles followed their pattern. Chapter 7. The mill's secrets. The sun had burned away the morning mist, leaving St. Mary Mead bathed in a clear, pale light that sharpened the outlines of its thatched roofs and winding lanes. Miss Jane Marple, her black umbrella now folded and tucked under her arm, walked with purposeful steps toward the edge of the village, where Harold Grimsby's mill stood sentinel by the river. The mill, with its weathered stone walls and creaking wheel, was a landmark of industry, its rhythmic thud a heartbeat in the village's daily life. Yet today, as Miss Marple approached, it seemed to her less a symbol of honest toil and more a keeper of secrets, its shadowed corners hiding answers to the puzzle of Thomas Wren's death. Her visit to the bakery's ledger had confirmed her suspicions. Thomas had been probing the quality of Grimsby's flour, noting irregularities that suggested more than mere oversight. The locked cupboard in the bakehouse, the cryptic notes in Thomas's notebook, and the village whispers of Grimsby's ambitions all pointed to the mill as a nexus of motive. Miss Marple, with her keen understanding of human nature, knew that greed could twist a man's heart as surely as poison could end a life, and she was determined to see what truths the mill might yield. The path to the mill wound through a copse of willows, their branches drooping over the river like mourners. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and the faint, dusty temps of ground grain. As she neared the mill, the wheel's steady groan grew louder, a counterpoint to the soft rush of water. Grimsby stood outside, unloading a cart of sacks, his burly frame moving with a restless energy. His florid face broke into a smile at her approach, but it was a smile that strained, like a seam stretched too tight. "Miss Marple," he called, wiping his hands on his apron. "What brings you out this way? Come to see the mill in action." His tone was hearty, but his eyes flickered with unease, darting to the mill's open door as if expecting an interruption. "Good morning, Mr. Grimsby," she replied, her voice as gentle as the river's flow. "I was taking a walk and thought I'd see your fine mill. The village speaks so highly of your flour, and I've always been curious about how it's made." Her smile was disarming, but her eyes were sharp, noting the faint sheen of sweat on Grimsby's brow despite the cool day. "Happy to show you," he said, though his enthusiasm seemed forced. He led her inside, where the mill's interior was a maze of beams and gears, the air thick with the scent of grain and wood. Sacks of flour were stacked against one wall, their labels proclaiming their quality, while a great grindstone rumbled in the center, driven by the wheel outside. The noise was a steady hum, but to Miss Marple it was a backdrop to the subtler signs she sought. Grimsby's tense shoulders, his too quick gestures, the way his gaze avoided hers. "What a splendid operation," she said, her tone admiring, as she stepped carefully around a pile of sacks. "You must be very proud, supplying the village and beyond. Though I hear there's competition now from Lower Mead. That must be trying." Grimsby's smile tightened, and he busied himself adjusting a lever. "Trent's mill, he's no match for me. I've got new machinery coming, contracts in the works." He'll be out of business soon enough." His voice was confident, but Miss Marple caught a note of bravado, a hint of strain beneath his boasts. "How ambitious," she said, her eyes drifting to a corner of the mill, where a locked cupboard stood, its padlock glinting in the dim light. It was much like the one in the bakery, sturdy and unyielding, and her memory flashed to Thomas's notes about Grimsby's flour. "And Mr. Wren, of course, was one of your best customers. Such a tragedy, his death. Did he ever mention any concerns about your flour?" Grimsby's hand froze on the lever, and for a moment the only sound was the mill's rhythmic grind. "Concerns? No, nothing of the sort. Thomas was happy with my flour, always said it was the best." He turned to face her, his smile returning, but strained. "Why do you ask, Miss Marple? Village gossip getting to you?" She laughed softly, a sound as light as the dust motes dancing in the air. "Oh, you know how villagers talk, Mr. Grimsby. But Thomas was so particular, wasn't he? I heard he tested his flour to ensure its purity. It's only natural he'd notice anything unusual." Grimsby's face reddened, and he wiped his brow with his sleeve. "Tested it, did he? Well, he never said anything to me. My flour's clean as a whistle, always has been. If he thought otherwise, he was mistaken." His words were firm, but his eyes darted to the cupboard, a fleeting glance that Miss Marple did not miss. "Of course," she said, her tone soothing. "I'm sure it was nothing. Though that cupboard, there's such a sturdy lock. Important papers, perhaps." Her question was casual, but her gaze was steady. Watching his reaction, Grimsby's hand twitched, as if resisting the urge to move toward the cupboard. "Just old records, receipts and such. Nothing worth seeing. Keeps things tidy, that's all." He turned away, gesturing toward the grindstone. "Let me show you how this works, Miss Marple. Finest machinery in the county." She followed, her expression one of polite interest, but her mind was fixed on the cupboard. A man like Grimsby, with his ambitions and his rivalry with Josiah Trent, would guard his secrets closely. If Thomas had discovered something amiss, flour, perhaps, or something worse, Grimsby's livelihood could have been at stake. The locked cupboard, like the one in the bakery, was a tantalizing clue, and Miss Marple resolved to see its contents, one way or another, that, as Grimsby explained, the mill's workings. His voice loud over the grindstone's rumble, Miss Marple's eyes wandered, taking in the details: the sacks of rye flour, the faint smudge of white powder on the floor, the tools hanging neatly on the wall. It was a place of order, yet beneath it she sensed a current of unease, as if the mill itself were holding its breath. She thought of Thomas's ledger, with its doubled payments and cryptic notes, and of the village gossip about Grimsby's quarrel with the baker. Each piece was a thread, and the mill, she felt, was where they began to knot dot. Their tours was interrupted by a shout from outside. Miss Marple turned to see young Peter, the apprentice, standing at the mill's entrance, his lanky frame silhouetted against the daylight. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and urgency. "Mr. Grimsby," he called, his voice cracking. I just came to check on the next delivery. Mrs. Wren sent me." His words were halting, and Miss Marple noted the way his hands clenched at his sides, his gaze flickering between Grimsby and herself. Grimsby's expression hardened, though he forced a smile. "Delivery's not due till tomorrow, lad. You know that. What's Mrs. Wren want now?" His tone was brusque, and Peter flinched, as if struck by an unseen blow. Just checking," Peter mumbled, backing away. "I'll tell her." He turned and hurried off, his steps uneven, and Miss Marple watched him go, her mind turning over his sudden appearance. Had he come to the mill on Eliza's orders? Or was there another reason for his visit? His presence, so soon after the gossip about his late-night wanderings, was too coincidental to ignore. "Well, Miss Marple," Grimsby said, his voice regaining its heartiness, "that's the mill. For you. Got to get back to work now. Thanks for the visit." He ushered her toward the door, his movements hurried, as if eager to be rid of her. "Thank you, Mr. Grimsby," she said, her smile as serene as ever. "It's been most instructive." She stepped into the sunlight, her umbrella tapping the ground, but her thoughts remained in the mill's shadowed corners. Grimsby's evasiveness, the locked cupboard, Peter's furtive appearance all were pieces of a puzzle that pointed to a deeper truth. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead years ago, when a farmer's locked barn had hidden stolen goods, betrayed only by a nervous glance. Grimsby's mill, she suspected, held its own secrets, and she would need to tread carefully to uncover them as she walked back to Rose View. The village coming alive with the chatter of evening, Miss Marple's mind wove together the threads. Of the case, Thomas's suspicions about the flower, Grimsby's rivalry with Trent, Peter's uneasy presence, and Eliza's guarded grief formed a pattern that was growing clearer. The mill, with its locked cupboard and restless owner, was a place of answers, and Miss Marple knew that her next step would be to coax those answers into the light, as gently and surely as she coaxed a tangled skein into order. Back at her cottage, Janet greeted her with a fresh pot of tea and a question. "Did you find anything at the mill, Miss Marple?" "They're saying in the village that Grimsby's been burning papers at night, Tommy. Pierce saw smoke from the mill last week." Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting in hand. "Burning papers, you say?" She murmured her needles, clicking softly. "How very interesting. The truth, Janet, is like fluorite, sifts through the smallest cracks, if you know where to look." Her eyes gleamed behind her spectacles, and she knew that the mill's secrets, like the village's whispers, would soon yield to her patient scrutiny. Chapter 8. A Widow's Tale. The late afternoon light filtered through the laced curtains of Rose View, casting delicate patterns on the worn rug as Miss Jane Marple sat in her armchair, her knitting idle for the moment. The village of St. Mary Mead was settling into the quiet hush of evening, but her mind was far from restful. Turning over the threads of Thomas Wren's death with the precision of a needle threading a stitch, the ledger's revelations, the mill's locked cupboard, and the village's ceaseless whispers had woven a complex tapestry, and Miss Marple knew that the next piece lay with Eliza Wren, the baker's widow, whose guarded manner hinted at secrets yet unspoken. A second visit to the bakery, she decided, was in order not to pry, but to listen, for in listening she often found the truth. She rose, smoothing her skirt, and reached for her shawl, its soft wool a comfort against the evening chill. The walk to the bakery was short, the high street now empty, save for a few villagers hurrying home with their baskets. The bakery's sign, Wren's Loaves, hung still, its cheerful red letters a stark contrast to the sombre air within. Miss Marple knocked softly, and after a moment the door creaked open to reveal Eliza, her dark hair loosely pinned, her face pale but composed. The widow's eyes widened slightly at the sight of her visitor, but she stepped aside with a weary grace. "Miss Marple," Eliza said, her voice low. "How kind of you to come again. Please, come in." Her words were polite, but there was a strain in them, like a note held too long. and Miss Marple noted the way her hands clutched the edge of her apron, as if anchoring herself against an unseen tide. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, my dear," Miss Marple said, stepping into the shop. The air was stale, the shelves bare of fresh bread, and the counter, once bustling, stood silent, a reminder of the life that had been snuffed out. "I thought you might be alone, and in such times a little company can be a comfort." Eliza managed a faint smile, gesturing to a chair near the counter. "You're very thoughtful. It's hard, being here without Thomas. The quiet is the worst of it." She sat opposite, her hands folding and unfolding in her lap, and Miss Marple saw again the tremor that betrayed more than grief. They spoke for a moment of small things, the weather, the upcoming harvest festival, but Miss Marple, with her gentle persistence, steered the conversation to the heart of the matter. "It must be so difficult," she said, her tone warm with sympathy, "to lose a husband so devoted to his craft. Thomas was so particular about his baking, wasn't he? I heard he even tested his flour to ensure its quality." Eliza's hand stilled, and her eyes flickered with something fear perhaps, or caution. "Yes, he was particular," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He loved his work, maybe too much, always up before dawn, always checking everything twice. The flour, especially, he'd sift it, smell it, sometimes even mix a bit with water to see how it behaved." She paused, her fingers twisting the apron again. "Lately, he was troubled about it. Said it wasn't right, but he wouldn't tell me why." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, though her expression remained serene. "Not right? How curious. Did he mention Mr. Grimsby, perhaps? I understand he supplied the flour." Eliza hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. "He did, yes. Thomas said he'd spoken to Grimsby, asked him about the rye flour. He thought there might be something wrong with it, but Grimsby denied it. Thomas was angry, said he'd get to the bottom of it." Her voice faltered, and she looked up, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's with a sudden intensity. "But he never told me more. I wish he had. Maybe I could have helped." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes soft but searching. "It's so hard when those we love keep things to themselves. But you mustn't blame yourself, my dear. Thomas was protecting you, no doubt." She paused, letting the silence settle, then added gently, "Was there anyone else he confided in? Young Peter, perhaps, or a friend in the village?" Eliza shook her head, her lips tightening. "Not Peter, he was just the apprentice, and Thomas didn't share business matters with him. As for friends, Thomas kept to himself, mostly. The bakery was his world." Her voice caught, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, as if to stifle a sob or something else. Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the way Eliza's eyes darted to the bakehouse door, then back to her hands. The widow's grief seemed genuine, yet there was a reticence, a careful choice of words that suggested she knew more than she revealed. Miss Marple thought of the village gossip about Eliza's flirtations with the travelling salesman, Mr. Carver. Could her hesitation stem from guilt over an indiscretion, or was it fear of something darker, a secret tied to Thomas's suspicions about the flour? "You've been so brave," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "Running the bakery alone must be daunting. Have you had any help from Peter or perhaps others?" Her question was casual, but her eyes were keen, watching for any flicker of response. "Peter's been helpful," Eliza said, her voice steadying. "He's young, but he knows the work. And the village has been kind, bringing food, offering condolences. She paused, then added, almost too quickly, Mr. Carver, the salesman, stopped by yesterday to pay his respects. He's been a good customer. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her mind seized on the name. Mr. Carver, yes. Such a charming man, I hear. Always so attentive to his clients. Her words were light, but they carried a question, and she watched Eliza's reaction, a faint flush, a quick glance away. He's polite, Eliza said, her fingers tightening on her apron. Always has a kind word. But it was just a visit, nothing more. Her voice was firm, but Miss Marple caught the defensiveness, the way her eyes avoided meeting hers. An indiscretion, perhaps, or merely the fear of one being misconstrued. Either way, it was a thread to be followed. The conversation turned to practical Methuselah's plans for the bakery. The need to hire another hand, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere, piecing together the widow's tale with the other fragments of the case. Thomas's suspicions about Grimsby's flour, his notes of confrontation, and now Eliza's guarded admission that he had been troubled, pointed to a tension that had culminated in poison. But was Eliza merely a grieving widow, or did her reticence hide a deeper involvement? And what of Mr. Carver, whose name kept surfacing in the villagers' whispers? As Miss Marple rose to leave, she paused by the counter, her eyes resting on a small photograph of Thomas and Eliza, taken in happier times. Such a lovely picture, she said, her voice soft. You must treasure it. Eliza's eyes softened, and for a moment her guard seemed to drop. It was our 5th anniversary, she said, her voice barely audible. He was so proud that day, said we'd build the bakery into something grand. She blinked rapidly, turning away, and Miss Marple saw the glint of a terror. Was it something else? Thank you for your time, my dear, Miss Marple said, her tone warm. Do take care, and if you need a listener, my door is always open. She stepped into the evening, the air cool against her face, her mind alight with new questions. Eliza's words, her hesitations, her mention of Carver, they were all threads in the tapestry, and Miss Marple was beginning to see their pattern as she walked home. The village lamps casting long shadows, she thought of a case in St. Mary Mead years ago, when a widow's tears had masked a guilty heart. Eliza's grief seemed real, but grief, Miss Marple knew, could coexist with secrets. The salesman, with his slick charm, was a new figure in the puzzle, and his connection to Eliza warranted scrutiny. Had Thomas discovered an indiscretion, or was Carver linked to the flower's taint? The answers, she felt, lay close, hidden in the quiet moments of a widow's tale. Back at Roseview, Janet greeted her with a fresh pot of tea and a burst of gossip. They're saying at the tea shop that Mr. Carver's been seen at the bakery more than once, Miss Marple and Mrs. Tuttle. Swears she saw Eliza give him a parcel last week, all secretive-like. Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed. How very interesting, she said, her needles clicking softly. The truth, Janet, is like a loaf fresh from the oven. Needs time to cool before you see its true texture. Her eyes gleamed behind her spectacles, and she knew that Eliza's tale, with its hints of fear and secrecy, had brought her closer to the heart of the poisoned baker's mystery. Chapter 9. The Apprentice's Confession. The morning in St. Mary Mead dawned with a clarity that seemed to sharpen the village's edges, its thatched roofs and winding paths standing out against a sky of unblemished blue. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table in Roseview, sipped her tea and gazed out the window, her thoughts as precise as the ticking of the mantel clock. The puzzle of Thomas Wren's death was taking shape, each piece Grimsby's evasiveness, Eliza's guarded grief, the whispers of a salesman's charm fitting into a pattern that grew clearer with every encounter. Yet the figure of young Peter, the baker's apprentice, lingered in her mind. His nervous tics and furtive glances suggesting a boy caught in a web not entirely of his own making. Today, she resolved, she would speak with him alone, for youth, she knew, often held truths too heavy to carry in silence. She set out after breakfast, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, her straw hat tilted against the morning sun. The bakery was her destination, but she took a circuitous route through the village, pausing to exchange pleasantries with Mrs. Bantry at the grocer's and to admire the vicar's roses. Such detours, to Miss Marple, were never wasted. They allowed her to gauge the village's pulse, to catch the whispers that swirled like leaves in the breeze. At the grocer's, Mrs. Bantry had mentioned Peter's recent sullenness, a change from his usual cheer, and Miss Marple filed this away, sensing that the boy's unease was a thread worth pulling. The bakery, when she reached it, was quiet, its blinds half drawn, its air heavy with the absence of baking. Eliza was nowhere to be seen, but Peter was there, scrubbing the counter with a vigor that seemed more about distraction than cleanliness. His lanky frame tensed at the jingle of the door's bell, and his sandy hair fell into his eyes as he looked up, his face a mix of surprise and wariness. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice cracking slightly, as if caught between boyhood and manhood. "Didn't expect you. Mrs. Wren's outgone to see the vicar about arrangements." His hands gripped the rag, twisting it as if wringing out his own nerves. "No matter, Peter," Miss Marple said, her smile as gentle as a summer breeze. "It's you I came to see. I thought you might like a chance to talk, with all that's happened. It can't be easy, losing your master so suddenly." She settled into a chair by the counter, her small figure radiating a calm that invited confidence. Peter hesitated, his eyes darting to the bakehouse door, then back to her. It's been hard, miss," he said, his voice low. "Mr. Wren was good to me, taught me everything. I don't know what I'll do now." He resumed scrubbing, though the counter gleamed already, and Miss Marple noted the way his movements betrayed a restless energy. "You were fond of him, I'm sure," she said, her tone warm but probing. "He must have trusted you to let you mix his dough. Did he ever share his worries with you? About the bakery, perhaps, or his suppliers?" Peter's hands stilled, and for a moment he seemed to shrink, his shoulders hunching. "He didn't talk much about that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just told me to do my work, keep the ovens hot. He was particular, always checking the flour, the water, everything." He glanced at her, then away, his eyes fixed on a spot on the floor. Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her bag, would have clicked softly had she been knitting. But her mind was doing the work now, stitching together Peter's words with the villagers' gossip. "How curious," she said, her voice light. "I heard you've been seen near the mill at night, Peter. Tommy Pierce mentioned it, I believe. Were you running an errand for Mr. Wren, perhaps?" Peter's face flushed, and he dropped the rag, his hands clenching at his sides. I wasn't doing anything wrong, Miss Marple, I swear it." His voice rose, a mix of panic and defiance, and she saw the fear in his eyes, like a cornered animal's. "I was just meeting someone, a girl from the village. We'd talk by the river, that's all. Nothing to do with Mr. Wren." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle understanding, though her mind was alert. "Of course, Peter," she said, her tone soothing. "Young love is a powerful thing. But it's strange, isn't it, to meet so near the mill? Such an out-of-the-way spot." She paused, letting the silence work its magic, knowing that youth often crumbled under its weight. Peter swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "It was quiet there," he mumbled. "No one bothers you, but one night I saw something. Mr. Grimsby, he was burning papers in a barrel behind the mill. It was late, past midnight. I didn't think much of it, just thought it was odd." His words tumbled out, as if relieved to be free, and he looked at her, his eyes pleading for belief. "Burning papers," Miss Marple repeated, her voice soft but her mind sharp. "How very interesting. Did you tell Mr. Wren about it?" Peter shook his head, his face pulling further. "No, miss. I didn't want trouble. Mr. Wren was already cross with Grimsby, always muttering about the flour. I thought it wasn't my place." He looked down, his hands twisting again, and Miss Marple saw the weight of guilt in his posture, the burden of a boy who had seen too much and said too little. "You did what you thought best," she said, her tone kind but firm. "But it's important to be honest now, Peter. Did you ever see anything else at the mill or here at the bakery that seemed unusual? Anything Mr. Wren might have been concerned about?" Peter hesitated, his eyes flickering to the bakehouse door. "There was one thing," he said, his voice barely audible. "A few weeks ago, I saw Mr. Carver, the salesman, talking to Mrs. Wren in the yard. They were whispering, like they didn't want anyone to hear. I didn't think nothing of it, but Mr. Wren came out and saw them, and he looked angry. Didn't say anything, just went back inside. I never told anyone, miss, I swear." His voice broke, and he looked at her, his eyes wide with fear. Miss Marple patted his arm, her touch as light as a feather but steadying. "You've done right to tell me, Peter," she said. "It's a heavy thing, keeping secrets, especially. Now, you go on with your work, and don't worry. The truth will come out, as it always does." Her smile was reassuring, but her mind was racing, weaving Peter's confession into the pattern of the case. As she left the bakery, the village basking in the morning sun, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the mill and its secrets. Peter's story of Grimsby burning papers corroborated the village gossip, suggesting the supplier had something to hide, perhaps evidence of adulterated flour or worse. And the scene with Eliza and Carver, witnessed by Thomas, added a new thread to the tapestry. Had Thomas's anger stemmed from jealousy, or had he suspected a connection between Carver and the flour's taint? Miss Marple recalled a case in St. Mary Mead years ago, when a young servant's confession had unravelled a theft. His nervous honesty the key to the truth. Peter, with his boyish fear, was such a key, and she would need to handle him gently. Back at Roseview, Janet greeted her with a fresh pot of tea and a burst of news. "They're saying at the post office that Mr. Carver's been seen in Dannymoth. Miss Marple left the village yesterday, sudden-like, and Mrs. Hodges is still going on about her loaf, saying she hopes the bakery stays shut." Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed. "How very interesting," she said, her needles clicking softly. "The truth, Janet, is like a boy's confession. It comes haltingly, but it comes. We must listen carefully." Her eyes gleamed behind her spectacles, and she knew that Peter's words, with their hints of burning papers and whispered meetings, had brought her closer to the heart of the poisoned baker's mystery. Chapter 10. The poison's source. The sun hung high over St. Mary Mead. its rays piercing the morning haze and casting sharp shadows across the village's cobbled lanes. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl neatly draped and her straw hat tilted against the light, made her way to the home of Dr. Haydock, the village physician whose steady hand and sharper mind had often proved a valuable ally in her quiet investigations. The threads of Thomas Wren's death were weaving together Peter's confession of Grimsby's late-night paper vermin, Eliza's guarded hints of her husband's suspicions, and the ledger's tale of doubled payments and cryptic notes. Yet, the heart of the matter, the poison itself, remained elusive, and Miss Marple knew that science, not sentiment, would clarify the means of the baker's murder. Dr. Haydock's cottage, a sturdy affair with ivy climbing its walls, stood just beyond. The churchyard, the doctor, a wiry man with a lined face and eyes that missed little, welcomed her into his study, where shelves of medical books jostled with jars of herbs and a faint smell of antiseptic. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff but warm, "I might have known you'd be poking about this Wren business. Tea or something stronger?" "Tea will do nicely, doctor," she replied, settling into a worn armchair, her small figure dwarfed by its bulk. "I've come about the poison, you see. Arsenic, I understand, in poor Mr. Wren's bread. It's such a peculiar choice, don't you think?" Haydock nodded, pouring tea from a chipped pot. "Peculiar and nasty. I examined the body myself. Classic. Signs of arsenic poisoning. Stomach pain, convulsions, the lot. The rye bread on the counter was laced with it, no question. The police sent a sample to the laboratory in Danimouth, and it's arsenic, all right, mixed right into the flour." He leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "Not a mistake, Miss Marple. Someone meant to kill him." Miss Marple's fingers rested lightly on her teacup, her expression serene but her mind as sharp as a scalpel. "Indeed," she said, "and use the flour, such a deliberate act to turn a baker's craft against him. Have you any thoughts, doctor, on how the arsenic might have got there?" Haydock rubbed his chin, his gaze thoughtful. "Could have been mixed at any Point Mill bakery, even the supplier's cart. Arsenic's not hard to come by, you know. Farmers use it for rats, gardeners for weeds. But the quantity here was precise, enough to kill, but not so much as to be obvious in the dough. Whoever did it knew what they were about." "How very suggestive," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. "And the flour itself, Mr. Grimsby's, I believe. Did Thomas ever mention concerns about it to you?" Haydock shook his head, sipping his tea. "Not directly, but he did ask me last month about testing flour for impurities. Wanted to know if I could check for anything unnatural. I told him it'd need a proper laboratory, but he was cagey, wouldn't say why. Sounded like he suspected something, though." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, a sign of her mind at work. Thomas's suspicions, recorded in his ledger and notebook, now echoed by the doctor, pointed to a deliberate taint in Grimsby's flour. She thought of the locked cupboard in the mill, Grimsby's evasive bluster, and Peter's tale of burning papers. "A man like Thomas," she said, "so particular, would notice anything amiss. And if he threatened to expose it, well, that could be dangerous, couldn't it?" Haydock's eyes met hers, a spark of understanding passing between them. "Dangerous enough to kill for, you mean? You're onto something, aren't you, Miss Marple? I've seen that look before." She smiled, a gentle curve of her lips that belied the steel in her thoughts. "Merely pondering, doctor, but I think a visit to the mill is in order, to see what might be found. That cupboard, for instance, Mr. Grimsby was quite protective of it. Would you care to join me? Haydock raised an eyebrow but nodded. Might as well. Reed's been sniffing around there too, and I'd like to see what's what. Let's go. They set out together, the doctor's long strides tempered to match Miss Marple's measured pace. The mill loomed ahead, its wheel turning with a steady groan, the river glinting in the sunlight. Grimsby was outside, stacking sacks, his face reddening as he saw them approach. Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock, he said, his voice forced with cheer. Back again. What's this? A village outing? A matter of inquiry, Mr. Grimsby, Miss Marple said, her tone mild but firm. The police have confirmed arsenic in Mr. Wren's flour, I believe. We'd like to see that locked cupboard of yours, if you please. Grimsby's smile vanished, his hands clenching. Cupboard. It's just old records, like I said. Nothing to do with this. His. The voice was sharp, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of fear in his eyes, the way his gaze darted to the mill's door. Haydock stepped forward, his authority quiet but unyielding. All the same, Grimsby, we'll have a look. Constable Reed's on his way with a key, unless you'd care to open it now. Grimsby's shoulders slumped, and after a moment's hesitation, he produced a key from his pocket, his movements reluctant. Fine, but you'll find nothing but papers. He led them inside, the mill's hum enveloping them, and unlocked the cupboard with a grudging turn of the key. The door swung open to reveal a clutter of ledgers, receipts, and, tucked in the back, a small wooden box. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened as Haydock reached for it, revealing several glass vials, their labels faded but legible. Arsenocrat poison. The doctor's face hardened, and he held one up, his voice grim. Care to explain this, Grimsby? Face paled, his bluster crumbling. It's for the rats. We've got them in the grain stores. Always have. Nothing unusual about it. His voice was loud, but it trembled, and Miss Marple noted the sweat beating on his brow. Of course, she said, her tone soothing but her gaze piercing. Rats are a nuisance, aren't they? But so much arsenic in such a tidy box sits rather curious, don't you think, Doctor? Haydock nodded, slipping the box into his coat. This goes to the police, Grimsby. They'll want to test it against the flour sample, if there's a match. He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Grimsby stammered, his hands gesturing wildly. I didn't do anything, I swear it. That arsenic's been there for years, for the rats, like I said. But his eyes betrayed him, darting to the door as if longing to flee. And Miss Marple saw the fear of a man whose secrets were unravelling, as they left the mill. Constable Reed arriving to take charge of the evidence. Miss Marple's thoughts were a whirl of connections. The arsenic, so conveniently stored, matched the poison in Thomas's bread, and Grimsby's panic suggested a man with more to hide than rat traps. She recalled Peter's story of burning papers, Eliza's hint of Thomas's suspicions, and the ledger's doubled payments. Grimsby, with his rivalry against Josiah Trent and his boasts of expansion, had motive to silence a baker who threatened his trade, perhaps by lacing the flour with poison to eliminate a rival's ally. Back at Roseview, Janet greeted her with wide eyes and fresh gossip. They're saying at the grocer's that Grimsby's been asking around for a loan. Miss Marple says he needs it for new machinery, but some think he's in debt to Trent's mill. Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed. How very interesting, she said, her needles clicking softly. The truth, Janet, is like poison, it hides in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. Her eyes gleamed behind her spectacles, and she knew that the mill's arsenic, like the villagers' whispers, had brought her closer to the heart of the poisoned baker's mystery. Chapter 11. The motive unravelled. The vicarage in St. Mary Mead, with its ivy-clad walls and rose-bordered path, was a haven of tranquillity. Its parlour a place where confidences were shared over tea, and the villagers' troubles found a sympathetic ear. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a chinch-covered chair, sipped her tea with the vicar's wife, Mrs. Bantry. As the late afternoon light streamed through the windows, casting golden patches on the polished floor, the room was warm, fragrant with the scent of scones and lavender, but Miss Marple's mind was far from the comforts of the moment. The pieces of Thomas Wren's death were falling into place, the arsenic in Grimsby's cupboard, Peter's confession of burning papers, Eliza's guarded hints, and the ledger's tale of suspicion. Yet it was here, in the quiet of the vicarage, that she often found the clarity to weave those pieces into a coherent whole. Mrs. Bantry, her cheeks flushed with the excitement of gossip, leaned forward, her teacup clinking against its saucer. "Jane, you've been awfully quiet about this Wren business," she said, her eyes bright. "The whole village is buzzing arsenic in the flour, Grimsby's cupboard, and poor Eliza left to pick up the pieces. Have you worked it out yet? I know you've a knack for these things." Miss Marple smiled, her expression as serene as the vicarage garden. "I've been pondering, Dolly," she said, her voice soft but deliberate. "It's a sad affair, isn't it? A man poisoned by his own bread, in a village where everyone knows everyone's business. But human nature, you see, is the same everywhere. Greed, fear, pride, they're the threads that bind this mystery." She set her teacup down, her fingers resting lightly on her lap, and began to unravel the pattern she had woven in her mind. Thomas Wren, a meticulous baker, had suspected something amiss with Harold Grimsby's flour, perhaps adulteration, a common trick to stretch profits by mixing in cheaper substances like chalk or worse. His ledger and notebook, with their notes of gritty textures and cloudy samples, showed he had confronted Grimsby, threatening to expose him. Grimsby, ambitious and embattled by rivalry with Josiah Trent's mill in Lower Mead, could not afford such a scandal. His boasts of new machinery, his need for loans, and the village whispers of burning papers all pointed to a man desperate to protect his trade. Thomas was a proud man, Miss Marple said, her eyes distant. He tested his flour as any craftsman, would and found it wanting. He spoke to Grimsby, perhaps demanding answers, perhaps threatening to go to the authorities. And Grimsby, with his livelihood at stake, saw no other way to silence him. She paused, her gaze meeting Mrs. Bantry's. "Arsenic, you see, is so convenient, colourless, tasteless, and easily mixed into a sack of rye flour. Thomas, who sampled his dough daily, would never suspect it until too late." Mrs. Bantry gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "You mean Grimsby poisoned the flour deliberately?" "Oh, Jane, that's monstrous. But what about Eliza and young Peter? They've been so shaken, and there's all that talk about her and that salesman, Carver." Miss Marple nodded, her needles still in her bag, but her mind stitching the threads together. "Eliza's grief is real, I think, but she's afraid of gossip, perhaps, about her friendship with Mr. Carver. Peter saw them together, and Thomas saw it too, which may have added to his tension with Grimsby. But Eliza's fear, I believe, is of being implicated, not of guilt." She knew Thomas was troubled about the flour, but didn't know the full extent of his suspicions. As for Peter, he's a boy caught in the middle, seeing more than he should Grimsby's. Burning papers, Eliza's whispers, but too young to know what to do with it. She leaned back, her eyes narrowing slightly, and Clara Hodges, with her sharp tongue and her grudge about a shorted loaf. Her anger is real, but it's petty, not murderous. Her husband, though, watches and listens, and I suspect he knows more than he says. But the heart of this lies with Grimsby. His mill, his flour, his locked cupboard with its vials of arsenic, they tell a story of greed and desperation. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened, her scone forgotten. But how did he do it, Jane? And why just Thomas? Surely others ate the bread. Miss Marple's smile was faint but knowing. Thomas was particular. Dolly. He tasted his dough before baking, a habit Grimsby likely knew. A single sack of rye flour, laced with arsenic, delivered to the bakery. For Thomas's personal batch would do the trick. The rest of the village's bread was safe, because Grimsby's target was specific. He needed Thomas gone not just as a customer, but as a threat to his reputation and his rivalry with Trent. She thought of the mill's cupboard, the vials labelled as rat poison, and Grimsby's panic when they were discovered. Peter's story of burning papers suggested Grimsby had destroyed evidence perhaps records of adulterated flour or correspondence with Thomas. The doubled payments in the ledger hinted at a financial strain, perhaps blackmail or hush money. Though Miss Marple suspected it was Grimsby's attempt to placate Thomas while planning a darker solution. Mrs. Bantry shook her head, her voice awed. You make it sound so clear, Jane, but how will you prove it? Grimsby's denying everything, and the police are still testing that flour. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed behind her spectacles. The truth, Dolly, is like a knot it tightens under pressure. Grimsby's denials are too loud, his fear too plain. The police will test the arsenic against the flour, and I suspect they'll find a match. But more than that, it's his own actions, his burning of papers, his evasiveness that will betray him. We must simply wait for the right moment. As she spoke, the vicarage door opened, and Constable Reed stepped in, his face grim but purposeful. Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, he said, touching his cap. Thought you'd want to know the laboratory in Danamoth confirmed it. The arsenic in Wren's bread matches the vials from Grimsby's cupboard. We're bringing him in for questioning tonight. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged but her mind alight with satisfaction. Thank you, Constable. I trust you'll find Mr. Grimsby has much to explain. She rose, smoothing her shawl, and bid Mrs. Bantry goodbye, her steps light. As she left the vicarage, the motive, so long a shadow, was now clear. Grimsby's greed, his fear of ruin, had driven him to poison the baker who threatened his trade. The tapestry was nearly complete, and Miss Marple knew that the final threads would soon be woven. Back at Roseview, Janet greeted her with a fresh pot of tea and a burst of gossip. They're saying at the post office that Grimsby's been acting strange. Miss Marple locked himself in the mill all day, and Tommy Pierce says he saw him burning more papers last night. Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed. How very interesting, she said, her needles clicking softly. The truth, Janet, is like a fire, it consumes what tries to hide it. Her eyes gleamed, and she knew that Grimsby's unravelling was at hand, the poisoned baker's mystery nearly solved. Chapter 12. The Baker's Justice. The village hall of St. Mary Mead, with its polished wooden floor and rows of mismatched chairs, was an unlikely stage for the denouement of a murder. Yet it was here, on a crisp evening, that Miss Jane Marple stood, her small figure commanding the attention of a gathered crowd. The hall was filled with villagers, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Their whispers hushed as Constable Reed took his place beside her, his notebook clutched like a talisman. The death of Thomas Wren, poisoned by arsenic. Rye flour had shaken the village to its core, and now, with the evidence gathered and the threads of the mystery woven tight, Miss Marple was ready to lay bare the truth. Her shawl was neatly draped, her straw hat set aside, but her eyes gleamed with the quiet certainty of one who had unravelled human nature's darkest knots. "Ladies and gentlemen," Constable Reed began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of the moment, "we're here to discuss the matter of Mr. Thomas Wren's death. Thanks to Miss Marple's keen insight, we've pieced together what happened. I'll let her explain." Miss Marple stepped forward, her hands clasped lightly, her voice as gentle as the evening breeze, but clear enough to carry. "It's a sad business," she said, her eyes sweeping the room, taking in Eliza Wren's pale face, Peter's nervous fidgeting, Clara Hodges's sharp glare, and the absence of Harold Grimsby, who sat in custody nearby. "A good man, Thomas. Wren was taken from us, poisoned by the very bread he crafted with such pride. But murder, you see, is never just an act. It's a story woven from greed, fear, and ambition. And this story began with a sack of flour." She paused, letting the silence settle, her gaze steady. "Thomas was a meticulous man, as you all know. He tested his flour, weighed it, sifted it, because his craft was his honor. Some months ago, he noticed something amiss with the rye flour from Mr. Grimsby's mill-gritty textures, cloudy samples, an off-smell. He wrote it in his ledger, his notebook, and he spoke to Grimsby, demanding answers. But Grimsby, whose mill was struggling against Josiah Trent's in Lower Mead, could not afford a scandal. His trade was his life, and Thomas's suspicions threatened to ruin it." The crowd murmured, and Miss Marple raised a hand, her gesture as delicate as a stitch. Grimsby's ledger showed doubled payments from Thomas, perhaps an attempt to placate him, or perhaps a sign of deeper dealings. But Thomas was not appeased. He pressed Grimsby, perhaps threatened to go to the authorities. And Grimsby, desperate to protect his ambitions, saw only one way out. She paused, her eyes softening with sorrow. He laced a sack of rye flour with arsenic, knowing Thomas tasted his dough daily. It was a precise act, meant for one man alone, ensuring the villagers' bread remained safe, but Thomas would not. Eliza stifled a sob, her handkerchief pressed to her mouth, and Peter's face paled, his hands twisting in his lap. Clara Hodges sat rigid, her eyes narrowed, while her husband, silent as ever, watched with an unreadable expression. Miss Marple continued, her voice unwavering. "Young Peter saw Grimsby burning papers at the mill, perhaps records of adulterated flour or notes of their quarrel. Eliza knew her husband was troubled, but not the full extent of his suspicions, and Mrs. Hodges, with her grievance over a shorted loaf, added fuel to the village's suspicions, though her anger was not the poison's source." She turned to Constable Reed, her tone gentle but firm. "The arsenic in Grimsby's cupboard, labelled as rat poison, matched the poison in Thomas's bread, as the laboratory confirmed. Grimsby's denials, his panic, his burning of papers, they all pointed to his guilt. He acted not out of hatred, but out of greed, a desire to protect his trade at any cost." Grimsby, brought into the hall by two constables, stood with his head bowed, his burly frame diminished. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and Reed raised a hand for silence. "Mr. Grimsby," he said, "have you anything to say?" Grimsby's voice was hoarse, his eyes fixed on the floor. I didn't mean it to go so far, he muttered. Thomas was going to ruin me, said he'd tell everyone my flour was bad. Trent was already taking my customers. I just wanted him quiet. One sack, that's all it was. His words broke, and he sagged. The confession wrung from him like water from a cloth. The crowd gasped, and Eliza's sob broke free, raw and anguished. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice remained steady. Greed, you see, is a poison of its own, corroding the heart long before it touches the body. Thomas Wren died for another man's ambition, but the truth, as it always does, has risen to the surface. Reed nodded, signalling the constables to lead Grimsby away. The crowd erupted into whispers, but Miss Marple stepped back, her work done. As the villagers dispersed, Eliza approached, her face streaked with tears. "Thank you, Miss Marple," she whispered. "I didn't know. I didn't understand what Thomas was fighting for." "You loved him, my dear," Miss Marple said, her hand resting lightly on Eliza's arm. "That's enough." She turned to Peter, who lingered nearby, his eyes wide with relief. "And you, Peter, must look forward now. The bakery needs you." As she left the hall, the night air cool against her face, Miss Marple walked home, her steps light despite the weight of the evening. Back at Rose View, Janet greeted her with wide eyes and a fresh pot of tea. "Is it true, Miss Marple Grimsby?" "Confessed, indeed, Janet," she said, settling into her armchair. Her knitting resumed. "The truth, you see, is like a loaf, it rises in its own time, no matter how deeply it's buried." Her needles clicked softly, a rhythm as steady as her thoughts, and she reflected on the frailty of human nature. Greed's poison. Ambition's cost. St. Mary Mead was safe again, its secrets laid bare, and Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom, had once more brought justice to the baker's memory.